Welcome to Minority Report. I'm your host, Salomón Flamenco. On today's episode, we feature Laylit, which is a diasporic dance party for the SWANA region, which I think is really cool and different for this show. I'm really happy they came on, to be honest. I'm a big fan. I had them on because I've been to their parties. I've been to the parties in elsewhere. I've been to their party here in DC just recently, this past Friday, March 18th, for anyone counting. I'm a big fan of what they do, and I'm a big fan of their ethos, right? Which I think is just really forward looking and inclusive. The work Laylit has done is definitely an inspiration for me and for what I aim to do with this podcast. This is Laylit. I hope you all enjoy. Hello, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Forrest, can you please tell the audience who are you and what do you do?
My name is Phil. I'm currently in Montreal where I live, and I'm a co-founder of Laylit, which is a party based in New York and Montreal that highlights SWANA artists and music from the region and the diaspora. I guess that's a quick way to say it.
You can go the long way if you want. I feel like this is definitely the
I
better.
feel like this podcast is going to be the long way.
Yeah, more than likely. Let's talk a little bit more about Laylit because it's really cool. I've been to adjacent shows in New York, and from the get-go, I thought it was a really interesting thing that's happening, like almost this new artistic movement. Can you talk a little bit about how it came about and what's inspired it?
Of course. I mean, we certainly didn't start a movement, but we're definitely a part of one. I would say it's an ongoing movement that has ups and downs in history. But currently, the latest phase, I feel like started a little bit when Trump got in power, and we. I live in Montreal. I'm from Lebanon, and I've been in Montreal 20 years now. And I'm in a band called Wake Island, and we're both Lebanese. And we've been struggling a little bit throughout the almost 15 years now. We started in 2012 or something like that. So yeah, 10 years of existence, dealing with like Arab identity in North America. That was always a thing for us. So when Trump came into power, my band partner was in New York, living in New York temporarily for like a few years. So we would go down there a lot, and we could feel this tension that was happening as the administration was like doubling down. There was a Muslim ban and all this stuff back then. So it seemed like there was kind of a renewed oppression on multiple minorities. There were obviously the Black community and all. Like, I mean, it was heightened oppression, I guess, coming into light, or at least in subtle ways and non-subtle ways. And I feel like a lot of communities started really doing something about it in the arts sector, and a lot of parties and a lot of musicians started popping up, particularly in the Black, women, trans, like these communities started really waking up and rebelling. That was definitely a source of inspiration for us. And we're like, hey, I mean, our community also is in this situation where we are being constantly looked down on, oppressed, racialized, particularly since 9/11. I mean, let's not forget that.
Yeah.
So I guess this anti-Arab sentiment has always been there in some way, shape, or form, but it's grown a lot with things like 9/11 and the arrival of like Trump and the right in power. So it became almost natural for us to like affirm ourselves as artists, and we just wanted to share these parts of our culture with people in the United States and be like, hey, like you have these preconceived ideas of who we are and what we do and what our music sounds like. In our case, it's really music. So here's a taste of what we actually sound like today and what we actually look like today and what we care about. And so I guess that's a bit how it happened. It wasn't planned to be like what it is today. This wasn't the idea. The idea was just really to gather in a small room in New York and exist, really, and rediscover our own roots.
Mm-hmm.
Because for years and years, particularly after 9/11, we were just forced in some ways to erase who we were, this part of us, to fit in, because it was really not trendy
Yeah.
to be from the Middle East back then. And of course, I talk a lot about Arab identity and the Middle East and everything, but really it extends to the whole region, spanning from like Morocco and North Africa all the way to Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, we as a party, we have this focus on what we call the SWANA region, which is Southwest Asia and North Africa, which is a term that not many people know yet, but it's a term that we're trying to use to define the region that is typically called the Middle East and North Africa, because these terms are very, we call them a bit colonialist in a way that they're positioning our region in respect to where the other ones are. So it's like the Middle East as opposed to the West, you know.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get away from these terms, not in any type of radical way, but it's just a more proper way to describe the region that we're catering to.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a lot to say about this, obviously. So
No, of course, and even when doing research, I noticed that. I noticed the difference, that it seemed very purposeful to say SWANA as opposed to MENA, which is, I feel, maybe more well known, right?
Yeah, I mean, even MENA is not that well known in the mainstream. So we figured, why push MENA when we could just push SWANA at this point? But it is, I mean, we're not very radical about it, in the sense that sometimes, as I just did, like I'll use the terms Middle East, because at some point you have to also explain what you're talking about. Like if I just say SWANA, no one's going to really know what I'm talking about. So I explain it, and then eventually it will become a bit more clear. But it's just a conscious effort to allow ourselves to name our region the way we want it, because our region is one that's been subject to colonization for like centuries at this point. So it's the way to reclaim it in a honestly pretty soft way. There's no, I don't feel like there's any violence around the word SWANA or anything like that.
There's a lot of things I want to pull from what you just said too, and I'm thinking about it, but almost in the wake of the Trump presidency, right? I'm Central American. My family is from El Salvador, so I don't want to say exactly understand, but I'm a part of an ethnic group that is also politicized. So what fascinates me about this is the reclaiming your identity part, right? And affirming who you are when your identity has been politicized. How have you navigated that? How have you navigated between focusing on the cultural aspect, or just living in this zone that you are put into and not so much want to be a part of? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things at play here. There's the politicization of the identity, for sure, that kind of makes you and encourages you to suppress it, particularly for immigrants who move to America or Canada. Canada and America are very different, but let's just talk a bit broadly now about North America. But on the other hand, there's also, in my experience, at least my personal experience, there is a pre-existing kind of inferiority complex when it comes to looking at the United States from the outside, from, like in my case, from Lebanon, as this like wonderful place and free place. And like there's this whole US marketing, you know, about like how amazing it is and how everything's perfect and human rights and everything. So we grow up adoring everything that comes out of Europe and the United States, and our culture is shaped by these products and these films and these music bands that come out of there. And from childhood, I wasn't encouraged that much to be connected to my own culture, because we have this fascination, particularly in Lebanon, with what's happening in the West, you know. So arriving in North America, already I was like ready to dive into that culture. And at the same time, I was told, you can also forget your own culture. Like, don't bother, because we hate you right now. You just bombed us. So these two factors together are, I mean, it's not just coming from the outside, it's coming also from inside the community. This kind of almost, not shame, but it's a form of shame of like, our culture is inferior, and so let's focus on this other supremacist culture in a way. I mean, it's a super complex subject, but like, I'm trying to like simplify it. But there's these, I feel like there's these two forces at hand here. And of course, when you hear around you, oh, Arabs are terrorists every day and every day and every day and every day, and everyone from every other community starts thinking it, not just like white people. I mean, Latino people, everyone's pretty much grouped behind this idea in 2001, 2002 of like fear. Same way they're doing it again with Russia now, and I mean, it's like it's the same fear mongering thing that happens, and we were just happened to be at the center of it. We were at the center of it before the Gulf War with the first George Bush. I mean, it's cycles of villains in the U.S. I don't know if Latinx people were ever the villains, but I guess in the context of like drug wars and all this narrative.
Yeah.
But in terms of the terrorism, it was like either Russians or Arabs intermittently for 10 years at a time, and now I guess Chinese have made an appearance now as the terrorists. So it's weird what is done to immigrants on that sense when you come to America. And yeah, I mean it's very easy to let go of your culture. Like it's a very difficult process for some and very simple process for others, depending on who you are and where you're from originally. But yeah, I didn't realize until 10 years later how dehumanizing it was to actually lose this connection with my home culture. And I used to go back to Lebanon every year, once or twice even. But even there, people are obsessed with American culture. So it's easy to lose yourself. And so doing this party for us was a way to like force ourselves in a way to like reconnect musically at the very least to this culture. And we're like, let's just do research and play this music as like a motivator, like, oh, we're gonna be DJs. We weren't really DJs before that. Like we had DJed a little bit for fun, but in terms of me and Nadim, which is my band partner in Wake Island, I would say that Laylit was our first real DJ experience, because DJing is not just playing songs, it's really about sharing and discovery and everything. So our partner, though, our third partner, Safir Shamaoun, he's from Syria. He, on the other hand, came from a very different musical background. He had extensive knowledge of music from the region. And this exchange between us is also part of how the Laylit started and why it started and why these three people. There was a beautiful exchange of music and discovery through each other that really encouraged us. And his story is very different from ours. And I'm not here to like speak on his behalf, but every immigrant has a story. It's not immigrants as one big group. So I can only speak for myself and extrapolate a bit for others.
Yeah, of course, but I'm really interested too, because when I read about Laylit and the greater movement of SWANA parties that are coming up, right? There's Laylit, there's Haza, there's Disco Teran. I'm really fascinated in where you see yourselves in the greater conversation.
I mean, we have a pretty clear vision of what we're trying to do, and we really love and respect all the parties. As a matter of fact, we encourage each other all the time. We just had the Haza party within Laylit party in Montreal 3 days ago. It's very important for us to foster the scene and not just our party, because we really believe that there's a lot of space. We're not fighting for space. There's a huge lack everywhere in the US, everywhere in Canada, like there's space. So we're not going at it from a competitive mindset at all. And each party is naturally fulfilling a different role. And what we're trying to do is very clear to us. Like we're really trying, I mean, there's a few things, but what we're trying to do is to really take the Arab SWANA dance floor, it looks to the future, like we're trying to not reinvent it, but just keep it up to date, because a lot of parties before us currently even are playing on stereotypes a lot, and we don't like doing that. We don't like any orientalization, exoticization of our culture. Um, there's so much going on that is groundbreaking musically in from the region, from the diaspora artists, and we really want to be this platform where these artists and this music can be played and recontextualized in the modern world. This is not like a nostalgia party at all. There's a nostalgia element in it for sure, because we do respect that aspect of the culture. It exists at every one of our party. There's always this kind of section where it's like pop and like nostalgia and like let's reminisce a little bit. But it's always looking forward. We really try to look to the future, change these perceptions of what a party like ours should be or could be, and try to really like, I don't like to say educate because it's a bit pretentious, but we're really trying to present something to people that they haven't seen before, even though it's right there, accessible to them from their culture. They understand it, they understand the words, they understand the references. But I feel like a lot of, because we're catering a lot to immigrants since we're in America, you know, so there are so many ways of immigration, and a lot of immigrants just stalled culturally. Like they stuck with what they knew and they just keep perpetuating it out of nostalgia and out of like comfort to just feel connected. But it's been 50 years, 100 years sometimes, and we need to upgrade this. We need to upgrade this definition and this identity, so that we're seeing like the modern and thriving culture, not something of the past that is just perpetuating itself. So that's one of the big missions we have. And there's other aspects of how we also function is in terms of representation. It's extremely important for us to change who has a voice on the scene. So we're talking about giving voices to women, giving voices to queer people, and that's something that is not very typical of our community in the past, of like having that strong of a presence for these communities and minorities, and reinventing what it, like, not reinventing, reshaping, sorry, what a scene looks like, because it used to be like a bunch of pop stars and a bunch of men and a bunch of like, you know. So we're also trying to work hard on this when it comes to booking and programming, and oftentimes also encouraging artists to get into it that did not even think that there was a place for them. So but all that's a very tricky process, but I think so far we're doing well on this front. And yeah, trying to think also like in terms, yeah, I mean, I don't like to compare with other parties because I think every party has a place and a role, but we're really trying to center on music and artists and creating this scene and creating this this feeling that the community is evolving and modern and exciting and worth mentioning, and obviously taking space in the nightlife, you know, like not be on the fringe, not be a party that's exclusively designed to be attended by SWANA people. Like it's very important for us to have very diverse crowds. We don't exclude anyone because we do want to have this friction on the dance floor, because we really believe that by creating this friction between people and people actually meeting each other and seeing each other, that's how like mentalities evolve, you know. So that's definitely part of our mission, is to bring people together that are not used to be together, whether communities meeting or within even our community. I was mentioning the queer aspect, for example. It's not very common in history to find parties like ours where you have drag queens and queer dancers and queer DJs around you everywhere, you know. And for members of the community who are not raised with this open-mindedness, to be around people like this is eye-opening. It can be tricky at first, but once you spend an hour or two, you're like, oh, okay, well, it's all good now. You know, like I can let them be. You can all be in the same room, enjoying the same common thing. And there's an invisible bond that gets created between people. And that's also where all the nostalgia and pop comes in. And its whole power. It's to bring people together. Oh, we all like that same song. So we're at this moment we're together. And this is like subliminal, but when you're dancing, okay, when you're someone who was raised, say, homophobic, and your favorite song comes on, and there's a bunch of drag queens around you dancing to that same song, there's something that happens subliminally where you're like, oh, we have something in common, which is usually when you go into stereotypical thinking, you're like, oh, well, I'm homophobic, they're a drag queen, therefore we have nothing in common. So we're creating these little moments where people share a moment, share a song, share a dance floor, hoping to contribute a little bit to this acceptance. And that works both ways, by the way. It's not just, I mean, we also have to have a certain amount of understanding of where some members of our community who are close-minded come from and how they were raised, and allow them to evolve too, you know, along with us. So it's not a big process, and it's way less messy than we thought it would be, actually. So that's the good news.
That's what I was thinking too, right? I mean, that is the beautiful part of music. Like there is that connectivity to it that everyone can be drawn towards, right? Where it's even if we disagree or we have been raised in these different contexts, there is this pillar that combines us, right? It like helps us find common ground, you know?
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of times conflict is very wordy and very intellectual. So when you bring music and dancing into the equation, these things go away. So it becomes about emotions. And at the end of the day, human emotions, as complex as they are very basic. So it's very easy to find common ground emotionally with people that you completely disagree with. And things like music and films and dance, these are the things that tell you to shut up for a second and just like feel something instead of say something. And I think that helps a lot.
Yeah. I want to go back to something because it was interesting when you were talking about this. What first drew me to Laylit, and I think I said this at the beginning, but I'll repeat it, is just it does feel like it's at the forefront of something, even if I myself maybe don't have the language to voice that, right? Like it is a part of this movement that I think is really great and is at the forefront of bringing this new culture, or not new culture, but the future, right? It's very forward thinking in that way. But I'm curious to get to that point, what were some of the challenges in cultivating this space?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a movement happening. I don't know where it started. I don't know where it's going, but it's not just in music. It's not just in parties. We're seeing it happen in film. We're seeing it happen in comedy. There's something. And when we started, it wasn't felt as much as it is today. So it's hard to pinpoint how much influence we've had, how much influence we received. Like it's an organic process. And I think it started with 9/11, ruminating. At some point, the oppression has to come out in some way. Now, in terms of challenges, I mean, the number one challenge was to make, I guess, venues trust us. Wasn't challenged in the sense that people were closing their doors on us. We were very strategic about which venues we chose to operate in and how we grew. We wanted to go to venues who were encouraging diversity and encouraging tolerance and inclusivity. So we started on a 50 people dance floor in a place called Moodring in Brooklyn. It's one of our favorite places to the day. It's just a space that was just open to try things, that weren't thinking about like bar sales or anything before we booked them. I mean, obviously we started on a Wednesday night there because I mean, that's how it is. You have to prove yourself. So I think that was a challenge, is to prove ourselves. And honestly, with the help of the crowd who just showed up every time, and every time bigger and bigger and bigger. We had to switch venues 4 times in 2.5 years. And I think at this point, part of what we contributed to in New York, people like us in Disco Teheran and a party called Jella Party also, who started a little bit before us, is to establish this trust that our community is going to show up, which is what promoters and bookers and venues care about. Because we are operating within the music industry here, which is tough. It's a very tough industry. It's one I've been in for 15 years now. So I've lost my illusions about what it is and what it isn't. I know how to approach it, and we understood from the beginning that we're gonna have to play that game a little bit, but we wanted to play it fair and square and show and work the industry from the side. We're gonna do our thing, and you're come to us because we're gonna prove it without the mechanisms of the industry that we're capable of doing something like this. So we just grew and grew and grew until now, like we're occupying one of the hottest space in Brooklyn, and we take over the whole venue every couple of months. And now we're every month or two, there's like a presence of our community that is like very, very strong, whether it's at our party or the other parties, taking over the cool spaces, not fringe areas, not far away places. We're not doing this in Jersey, you know? I mean, it's totally fine to do it in Jersey, but the idea is to, when you're able to go to the epicenter of world culture almost at this point and take a space, a large space, it really helps perceptions. It helps other cities pay notice. Other communities wake up and say, oh my God, who thought we could actually have these parties? Like the number of messages we received from people across the States, across Canada saying, oh my God, I never thought this could happen. Come to our city, come to our city, come to our city. And people in the cities we go to writing us saying, I never in my life thought I would ever be in a room like this, because it was kind of we knew that no one would trust our community to be able to hold events in cool spaces, not restaurants or cafes with not the sound system or nothing. So people never thought that they could party like this, and they never thought that they could party like this also as queer people. That's a very important thing. So I think with the party, we've reached a place where we are now a force that people can't ignore. So when we approach venues now, we come with a CV, you know, we're like, we've sold out like all these venues in all these cities, and so you can trust us. And we understand that they're not here to do charity, you know, they're here for numbers. They want to sell. It's tough after the pandemic, so it's not like, oh, venues are evil. It's just a matter of understanding how they work, and also be selective who you work with, because everyone wants a piece of this now. And a lot of promoters want to come grab a piece of the pie. Some of them from the community, some of them not from the community, some of them with good intentions, some of them with bad intentions. So we have to filter this. Also, we work with a lot of artists, and obviously when we highlight artists at the party, random promoters will show up to them. I want to give them opportunities, which is really one of our goals, is for all these artists to have opportunities. But not everyone is doing it for the right reason. So it's about trying to also understand who's who in the industry. Other challenges, honestly, is that our community didn't have enough artists when we started. Like there weren't enough DJs to book. So we went very fast into not a headliner kind of mentality as a party, but more of a let's create new headliners. So we trusted, and we still trust, starting DJs. I mean, we developed a culture at Laylit where we announced the lineup maybe a week or 10 days ahead of the party, and very often we're either sold out or close to sold out before we even tell people who's playing. So there's this trust that's happening, which allows us to cultivate names and artists and elevate them. So that was a challenge, and I think we've reached a point now where we have a good pool to work from, but it's still challenging. Because when you occupy a place like Elsewhere, you have to like, there's this stress also in a way of like making sure that we reimburse our cost and the venue and that filling it up. And so it's another game. And usually that game is played with headliners. It's like, oh, you get a headliner and then you fill out the room. And we don't play that game. So we're trying to, that's a big challenge for us, is to trying to play this kind of mid-level, I guess, industry game without following all the rules that make it work. So we always have doubts. Like we always take risk, and we're like, how will this go? How will that go? Which is part of the fun also.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but just by the nature of this project, you kind of have to break rules. I mean, this sound, like
Yeah.
that's the interesting part about it. Like I did not know that part about how you find headliners, and it was my next question was how do you cultivate and find these artists? But I mean, that's just incredible, you know?
Yeah. I mean, there's because we focus a lot on local artists, but we also, I mean, as we grew bigger, we now have the ability to get artists from abroad.
Mhm.
And that's a whole other challenge because it's one thing to get artists from other diasporas, so from London or from Paris or something like that, which we now can afford and which we do. When it comes to bringing artists from the SWANA region, that's a whole other challenge. We're talking visa issues. We're talking, I mean, try to book a Palestinian artist at the party, which we try and we keep trying. It's very difficult. I mean, they don't even have a passport at this point in a lot of the times. And even if they do, getting a visa to play the United States is increasingly difficult because you have to, it's not just a matter of getting a tourist visa, which is already hard enough, but musicians have to get performance visas. There's just actually a law that is proposed now to increase the price by 5 times of how much it would take. And you have to do it like 6 months ahead and pay lawyer fees. It's very, very prohibitive. And believe it or not, it's the same for Canada. Like it's not even just the other region. It's everyone who's not American.
Mhm.
So that's one of the big challenges we have is to figure out logistics of how to bring artists from the region here, which is also part of our mission is to expose people to them and to create this network. I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the goals of Laylit is to create this network and circuit, a touring circuit, because other than the world music touring circuit, there isn't really a circuit for a Jordanian band to come play in America and have an audience. So we're creating like by going to multiple cities, that's our reasoning is to like be able to one day, and actually we're doing it already, be like, hey, you're an artist from Jordan, you're an Iraqi artist in London, come, we'll give you 5 shows
Mhm.
and do a tour, for example. So these things are now increasingly possible. And yeah, like I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but a lot of them are logistical. Um, but I would say, yeah, the biggest challenges was to get the trust of venues and of the wider public to understand and break those stereotypes they had about our culture. And luckily enough, other parties around us were working towards the same goal in different ways. So it became a cumulative effect.
Mhm.
You know?
I don't want to ask about that last part too, about breaking stereotypes, because by this point, I heard about Laylit from a friend, but doing research, you've been showcased in the New York Times, you've been showcased in global news. How have you, how do I phrase this? What have you made of the reaction so far? And what have you considered when reading them and listening to them?
I mean, the reaction, you mean from the public or
I guess
from the
it's twofold, right? Because initially I thought about from the public, but then also from just mainstream recognition.
yeah, I mean, the public was honestly the moment they step into the party, they like it. So we didn't have an issue convincing the general public. We had some issues convincing our own community sometimes that because at the beginnings of the party and even now and when we go to new cities, the real hunger is for like the pop music, for example. So to convince a crowd that has been waiting their whole life to hear these pop songs and dance to them, that oh, listen to these techno tracks too and listen to these funk tracks too, that was definitely a work in progress which we're very conscious of, and we deliberately paced it out little by little so that our crowd is not like hit in the head with everything, because there's no point doing that. So we still provide a bit of everything. So that part of the public reaction we needed to work on and be conscious of. And honestly, we were happy to deliver these goods because, and particularly for the queer community, because these are songs and that we were not allowed in a way to dance. I'm a gay man myself, so growing up in Lebanon, I couldn't just go and like dance to some like pop stars and like move my hips or everything. Like this is absolutely not okay culturally.
Mhm.
So there is that aspect that made us really stick to this kind of nostalgia pop aspect for a little bit, and little by little bring in the rest of the music. And then as people were enjoying it, they started telling their friends, as you say. So everything that's happened to us, we owe to our audience who comes and enjoys themselves and then tells their friends. It's all been word of mouth. In all honesty, we have not spent a single dollar of marketing since we started, not a dollar. And it's because when you create these kinds of dance floors and fulfill these needs, which are not just dancing needs, they're just emotional needs. When I go to parties like this, I mean, I went to parties like this before even starting this, and you feel nourished, you feel seen. You go back home and you're like, okay, time of my life. This is the best night of my life. You call your friends, you start telling your friends. Next thing you know, you're telling your Swedish friends about it. And then they're like, oh, what's happening? That's the new cool thing in town, whatever. And then they just come to the party and they tell their friends. So there's the snowball effect. And when this happens, then occasionally a journalist will be there and they're like, oh my God, what is this? I'm going to write about it. And so you end up in the New York Times. And that was a very humbling thing for us. We didn't see it coming. When it came, we didn't think it was going to be like a full page like that. But it's just because we don't operate with that mindset. So things naturally come in that sense. Like we didn't pitch to be featured in the New York Times. And the most beautiful thing about that article is that it was an article about the scene, more so than it was an article about us or another party. So it was just an article about exactly what we're trying to do, which is to take space. So we're like, hey, our community exists and we're nice. I mean, then go look at the comments on the New York Times article, and then, I mean, it's the internet. So I mean, we weren't very touched by them, but it's funny how anything that anyone posts, you always have trolls on there. But I don't think it's representative of the actual sentiment. I think people are starting to understand that in many ways, like it's cool to be involved with our community now. And if that's our only achievement, I'll be very happy. Like I would fold everything and stop tomorrow if that's what it's already been achieved. And I think there is this perception now changing in people's minds, at least in the underground. I mean, we're still an underground party, that we're adding cool to terrorist in people's heads. So now there's like Arabs are terrorists and also they're cool. So we're like on the way to becoming a complex community like every other community, And we're behind, I mean, in terms of like the work that was done. There wasn't a lot of cultural work done, I think. I mean, there's a lot, obviously, but it hasn't been seen by a lot of people yet in America, as opposed to, say, Black communities or Latinx communities, which, with all the shit that comes with being part of these communities, the cultures, like, you've worked hard enough in these communities to get to a certain mainstream status, whether in music or film or art, but there hasn't yet been that moment for SWANA, for Arabs, for this community where there's staples and where you see like shows on NBC or shows on HBO representing. This doesn't exist yet. We're not there yet. And I'm hoping that this movement is just going to put us as a community where we're able to express ourselves and be part of the American tapestry, I guess, of culture. But then it doesn't mean our issues will end and racism will end or anything. But at the very least, we'll be able to express ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point too, because yeah, when I first entered the scene, when I first was a part of the scene in my own small way, what struck me immediately was, how do I say this? I was at once, it was like a fish out of water, right? It was something I'd never really experienced just because of my own worldview. But it was still so beautiful, and I still felt a part of it. It was it was good vibes. There's no other way to like intellectualize it or make it into academia. It was just good vibes with everyone having fun and participating in the way that they knew how, right? Yeah.
And I mean, one thing we definitely pay very much attention to is how other communities react to our party. And I've always felt that people from from other minorities have a very particular connection with our party because they recognize it. They recognize the sentiment, and I think that's really important. When you compare that with like the white audience, for example, I hate to generalize like this, but it's a different relationship because the white audience we have is one that comes in with respect, and they come in with curiosity. They don't understand necessarily the importance of this culturally from a racial standpoint, but they could understand it from an oppression standpoint, because you could be white and oppressed, you could be white and you could be queer, you could be white and trans. It's not a question of white skin color, but there is a particular aspect that is about skin color and where you come from, and that is something that we have this common ground with other communities, and so we're not surprised when people from El Salvador will come to the party and be like, I don't know why, but there's something here that speaks to me. And that's something we think about a lot. But we try not to segment our audience like this and think about white or brown or whatever. I mean, we just hope that they will all show up. And it's not by mistake that we agree to do our party at elsewhere or decide to do it there. It's because it is a place that is naturally mainstream, that people seek out. Our role is not just to market to people. People will seek this place out to check out what's happening, because there's a trust that if it's happening there, it's worth my attention. So we do get a significant amount out of walk-ins who come in and discover the party without even having heard of it ever. It's not significant. It's not like a huge portion every night, but I would say a good 10% of the audience now at elsewhere is probably a walk-in audience that is like, let's go to elsewhere tonight and see what's happening. And hopefully from these people, we can retain some of them and keep growing like that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about, what's the word you used? Segmentation, right? I want to talk about that because the name world genre to me seems very broad, right? And so this question might be a little problematic, but how would you categorize this genre? Is it SWANA house? Is it, what would you say? And then just can you talk a little bit more about the limitations of the world genre label?
Well, we're against it 100%. So you'll never hear that word coming from us. Like, world music is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. Like, even like, it doesn't mean, like, it's just so weird that it exists. Like, honestly, even French music is world music at this point. So it's not even about racism anymore. It's just about cultural laziness. It's like, if I don't understand the words, it's world music, pretty much. And so, I mean, there's no point debating it. It's just a lazy genre. So in terms of what we call things, I mean, the reason we want to have a diverse audience is because our goal is not to have this Iraqi artists play only to Iraqis. Like, the whole point is to make where they're from irrelevant. So it's not SWANA house, it's house. It's just the artist doing it just happens to be from SWANA. Like, we don't call it American house, or, I mean, you could have a subgenre just to define where it's from. There's no problem. Yeah. But I mean, the goal for us is that when an artist comes and plays techno at our party, it's not like Arab techno, it's techno, and we understand that it takes a middle step to get there. And so we do make a point that it's the way, I guess we phrase it, it's techno made by SWANA people, but it's still techno. And a lot of it sounds a lot like British techno. Like, it doesn't always sound like it's from the region, because the same way not every American song sounds like a Southern country song. Like, there's a lot of American songs who sound like French song, and a lot of Swedish song who sound American. So the world is like culturally very mixed now. So it's very normal that when you grow up in Lebanon or Iraq or Jordan or whatever, you're listening to what's going on outside. And I'm not sure that's something I could generalize about Americans. I don't know that in my observation, Americans don't listen to a lot of foreign music because the industry here is so big that you can even not even catch up. But when you're outside and there's no music infrastructure and there's very little bands and very little project and it's all underground, all you can do easily, honestly, is just listen to what's happening in Europe and the States. And so that's a secondary mission of ours also, is to try to, like, by creating these touring circuits, try to inspire people from the region there to, like, keep building infrastructures. And there's a lot of plans now in the region, particularly in the more of an Arab region, where there's like a really big budgets and efforts to create that infrastructure, but it's a long process. And we're just trying to be the counterpart in North America, where we can extend that infrastructure and create the circuits outside. Remind me what the question was. I forgot.
You answered it in a way.
I'm drifting.
You answered it in a way because I was asking, how would you define the genre?
Oh, yeah, the genre.
Yeah, and I just think it's interesting because in my mind, I agree with what you just said, but some part of me still feels like, in 10, 20 years, there'll be a second generation Lebanese American who will do something else and then call it Lebanese house, right? Or it's weird how culture works like that. Like,
it's all marketing when you talk about these labels, Like, I mean, I would love to spend hours talking about them, but at the end of the day, labels were created so you can go find CDs at like HMV and Virgin Records and to, like, oh, let me go to the jazz section. But I mean, what's jazz? Like, it's nothing.
yeah.
Like, it's just a name. Like, how is jazz not the same as classical music? I mean, it's all the same thing. These labels, I mean, honestly, we don't spend too much time worried about labels because it's hard to use labels like this and not be stereotypical and limiting. So, but yeah, if you ask me, then if you've been to the DC party, I mean, there were like 4 genres of music, if you want to talk genres played. So I can't tell you the party is this genre. If you come to New York, there's 3 rooms simultaneously playing music of completely different genres. You have like Afghan funk in the loft, while there's like techno downstairs and a crazy like experimental techno on the other room. Like, I don't know how to define the one sound of the party.
Yeah.
You could call it the Laylit sound if you want.
I like that.
But that means nothing. But I mean, if you want to have the label, there you go.
This is just reminding me of another. I'm sorry to bring up the labels again, but it does remind me of a previous conversation I had where she was Nigerian American. She's a fashion designer, and she talked about how labels at once are meaningful but meaningless. Like they are whatever you want them to be. But going back to the marketing thing, I am really impressed you guys haven't spent any marketing money because it sure has worked. I mean, you guys have gotten your name out there in this moment, in this particular scene, and it's great. Like there's no other way for me to say it. Like I had so much fun, and I'm looking forward to the next one, in DC. Like I'm gonna be there. I'm really excited about it. I I wanted to ask you another question, and I'm just curious what your thoughts were on this. What your thoughts were on this. Um, you're a queer man, you're a gay Lebanese man, and house music originated in this very specific moment of oppression of Black and Latin queer people, right?
Yes.
It's really interesting to me to kind of, I mean, did you use that as an inspiration or as a jumping off point, or how did it influence the creation of this scene?
Actually, very much so. Let's just take a step back also and look at the musical scene right now, particularly in the Middle East region of SWANA. There's a lot of hip hop, for example. Hip hop was in no way created there. Obviously, hip hop was created in Black communities. It's the same thing I was saying earlier. It's this kind of like you recognize your struggle in someone else's struggle, and you adopt the genre. I personally think it's a beautiful thing to adopt genres. There's few cases where it's, I guess, not okay, and we can have this whole cultural appropriation discussion, but really at the end of the day, it's just when Black people started making hip hop, I don't know that they were conscious of how much impact it would have on an international level. and how inspiring it would be for someone who's oppressed in Egypt to be like, oh my God, this is how I want to express myself because I'm so inspired by how these people freed themselves artistically. Same goes with house and techno. I became very interested in techno music around 2016 when I found out about its history, because I used to think of techno as this like whatever trashy dance music in nightclubs, and this was my perception of it. I loved it, but I grew up with it in Lebanon. There's a big electronic music culture in Lebanon, so all the partying is like techno and house. It's not like, but this is the overwhelming like cool party vibe. But I always dismissed it as kind of like, because it's very Euro techno that we would listen to. So when I found out, I read this book called, oh my God, I forgot the name of the book. But it was a book on the history of techno. The name will come back to me. And reading about how it started in Detroit and all the struggles and the communities and the underground parties and how it came from disco and all this stuff. I'm like, I know this story. I know this feeling. And it's the creation of art to deal with oppression and to deal with being put on the sidelines, because that's literally what was happening in Detroit. Like these communities were literally put on the side. Actually, downtown Detroit was completely like abandoned, and these people just found drum machines that are like, let's have parties, and they did this. And that's in many ways what the seed was for me, at least, to be like, oh, a party is not just a party. It can be way more. It can create a movement. It can create a social change. And I'd never thought of parties like that before until I found out how all these like disco and techno parties started. So I became very fascinated with Detroit as a city, and that's one of the main reasons that we do the party there. Like before going to like any other bigger cities, we need to go to Detroit and honor the city and the heritage of how it inspired us to do what we do. So when making music, there's a difference between DJing techno and making techno, and or making hip hop. And so you have to approach it with the respect it deserves, with the knowledge of its history and how it's now transcended its history. I really believe these genres really have transcended the people who created them. But I also think it's important to acknowledge. I mean, I don't think anyone doesn't acknowledge where hip hop comes from at this point. It's pretty obvious. But techno and disco, though, most people don't realize where it came from, and they don't realize the suffering that came with it and the exploitation that came from it after. So we're very conscious of it. I don't think it's in any way exploitative to play this music. I think it would be if we had no idea what was going on and where it came from. But it's also not our prerogative to educate everyone about this particular issues. And I think it's in the Black and Latin communities, it's become an imperative. We hear it more and more. I mean, all the way to Beyonce now. So I'm very happy to see this education happening, because we can't do everything. You know, like we're just one little drop in the sea. But when you see around you that, oh, someone's got this, then you have to trust other parties, other artists, other communities, that we're all working towards the same idea, which is inclusion. So I don't feel like it's my job to educate people on the history of techno, because it's not my history. What I can educate is how techno has influenced our community and how people in our community have reacted to it and used it as a tool. But there's tricks, you know, like very often in my personal DJ set, I will bring in some early Detroit tracks to mix with tracks that I like from Egypt, for example, just to keep the context alive, you know?
Yeah.
Like a lot of like Juan Atkins and stuff like that always ends up there in the set just to make it exist and acknowledge its existence in that way. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Absolutely does. I never asked though, what genre did you, or sorry, what was the type of music you made before this? Because you told me you weren't a DJ at first. You got into
Well, I'm still a musician and still making music. And the music, I mean, I've gone through a lot of phases with my band. And I mean, we started as a prog rock band back in 2006. Then we became a little more rock, more like just indie rock, I guess what we used to call indie rock, again on labels. And now, actually, the last record we did was an homage to Detroit techno, adapted to our story and adapted to our feeling, but it's a pop record. And now we're making ambient music. So like I explore music a lot, and I don't like to be stuck in one genre. I think an artist is allowed to just explore. But none of the music we've made and released so far is extremely resembling of anything we play at Laylit. We're exploring it now a little more, because obviously most of what we listen to now is the music we DJ, the music we play. So naturally our minds and our spirits are going towards creating more and more music like this. But we're doing it our way, and again honoring the past, honoring the history. So right now we're in an exploratory phase, for example, where I'm learning Arabic singing and Arabic music theory, and Nadim is learning how to play the oud. And so we're taking this pause in creation to learn all these things so that we could honor them in the music we make. But the music we make is like it's in 3 languages, in English and French, and you could mistake it. I mean, for most of our career, we were trying, quote unquote, to be white. And then the shift happened on the last record we released, where we're like, enough, coincidentally with Laylit. So with the same idea of reconnecting to our roots, 2 very different approaches were born, and we didn't force any of the 2 onto the other one. Like we don't perform our songs at Laylit, like it doesn't make sense yet. So Laylit for us is not this way of getting famous or getting our band up or anything. Like it's not at all how we approach it. On the contrary, it's been a very freeing experience, because as Laylit thrives, it really frees us as a band musically to do whatever we want, because it's no longer the imperative of like, oh, we need a Spotify single and we need to make it and we need to go to South by Southwest. Like these things are all gone now from our minds, because we have this thing that is sustaining us also. So it's been a very big blessing to be freed like that, actually.
Yeah, thank you for that. I only have a couple other questions. You've been
Well, it's okay. I'm here.
But I did want to get this tool of reconnection, right? I feel as if let's be general and say Canada and the US, but being an ethnic minority or a minority in general comes with some trauma, right? Like oppression, trauma of migration, of travel. But being Arab or being part of the SWANA diaspora, I feel comes with a specific set of traumas. And you said this quote that really stuck with me when I read it, but it was the particular importance of those who have fled the Middle East and war and uprisings and refugee crises, right? And it is, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but if you look at Lebanon and Tunisia, Iran, Afghanistan, like it is.
I mean, all of the countries.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I didn't want to say it, but
yeah.
And so I think I'm gonna let you speak. I'm sorry, but I do think there is a particular importance of Laylit and of this scene in reconnecting people through these traumas, or not through these traumas, but allowing them to have a future. And I don't know if you wanted to say anything on that part.
Well, I grew up in the war. I was young, obviously. I mean, I was from 1 to 9 years old. So I lived it very much, almost like that film, the Italian film La Vita è Bella, where like parents were trying to shield us as much as possible from the realities. But it's still a fact that I grew up in a very comfortable, relatively wealthy family, you're not spared from these traumas with class. Like, war is war, and I still spent a lot of my childhood in underground shelters because our building could collapse any moment. Like, so these are not things that I was thinking about because you repress them and they just become part of your personality somehow. But what it also does to you is when you come to a place like America, it contextualizes and relativizes the problems. Like, sometimes you see what people are complaining about here and you're like, really? Like, that's the big issue right now? Like, you should just be grateful that you even have that thing that you're complaining about. And so, not to look condescendingly on it, but sometimes it's a little bit disturbing to see, on one hand, the fragility around us here, and on the other hand, their complete disregard of what's happening everywhere else in the world. So we're definitely hoping to share a little bit of that sentiment without being preachy. But we approach our lives here in America with a lot of awe. I think a lot of immigrants are very appreciative of, despite all the difficulties, but there's an appreciation to the fact that the place is trying to be welcoming, which is not something you can say about a lot of places we come from, like there's a lot of intolerance still existing in those regions. And I'm not going to get into details of this, but a lot of this intolerance was caused by colonization and particularly Christian colonizations and these kinds of guilts that were imported from Europe back then. And as Europe evolved and the region was kind of like constantly kept in a state of war by those same powers that had already invaded it originally, so it became this really nasty, vicious cycle where we were not in a position to evolve culturally because we were too busy with wars, too busy being manipulated against each other, whether in a country or between countries. So there's this feeling in our region that we've been played a little bit. And the irony of it is that we still immigrate to these countries that we believe are playing us. So there's a very difficult feeling to live with. I don't live in America, but I think if I did, I would feel very conflicted, contributing to this society, paying taxes to a country that is actively messing up our region. So Canada is not where I live. It's also very guilty of this, and there's this weird dichotomy of like, we're here and maybe we shouldn't be here, but on a personal level, it's the only place where we can come deal with these traumas, because for a lot of people, it's just impossible to live happily where you were born, and that's a curse that is very, very heavy. Mm-hmm. And I can speak for the Lebanese experience. It's a very difficult experience to grow up Lebanese and with this idea that the only opportunity for your dreams is outside, and that you would have to leave your family and have to leave your friends. Then add that being queer and like, okay, well, there's no way for me to live here openly and happily and without like watching over my shoulder all the time. And so I've always regarded it as a curse that I had to leave, that there was no option when I grew up that I could see myself staying there and being happy. So when you bring this over here, you could do one of two things: either completely get negative about it, or you could use this. There's a wisdom that comes with having lived through this. Like, I'm not 20 anymore, I'm approaching 40, and I've processed this. And I think one way to give back to our community, but also to the communities who've hosted us, like America and Canada, now that I'm a part of this society and that I feel like I'm a valid part of it, because I haven't arrived yesterday, like I've spent half my life here, and I feel like I've felt this for a little while now, but that my voice has importance here, and I'm as much entitled to my opinion on the society than anyone else, whether born here or not, and that my voice counts and my vote counts. And So the idea is to, through artistic activity, whether it's Laylit or my band, is to bring in this perspective to the cultural space of like, you can see things a bit differently. Why don't we, for example, with the case of Laylit, we could have easily become an exclusive party and be like Arabs only or SWANA only or queer only. But we're trying to show that it's possible to coexist. And I think in America, that's the most important thing to say today, politically. All we hear about is people on the extremes. Like, people are not interested in moderation. They're not interested in whatever's going on in the center. So what we can bring, since we're not in politics, so it's like a side art. That's the importance of art. Like, we bypass the political conversation and we come in saying whatever needs to be said, but a different way. So when you come to our party, what I'm hoping you can leave with is, oh my God, what if the world outside this room was like this? And that's just a little thought. So if there's other people working on other things, whether it's lawyers or politicians or educators, if everyone puts in a little bit of that sentiment, maybe we can get away from this like left-right mentality of like Republican versus Democrats and whatever. I mean, which is it's the same as world music. It's just these stupid labels that, and we're focusing on 3 or 4 issues, like gay rights and guns and all these things. Suddenly they're defining us, you know? But what about like the probably 90% of things that we actually agree on, we don't ever talk about? So that makes me personally very sad to see this, because I really believe that most times where like a Republican meets a Democrat, is they have a regular conversation that is not about those 4 issues. They'll find that they're just like nice people who just were taught to care about different things, and were also taught to antagonize people who don't agree with them on these things. And as much on the left as I am politically, I really have a lot of trouble dealing with how my group, the left, deals with the right. Like, I can't stomach it. I just find it the same way. Like, I see Christians being cruel and then praising the Bible, which tells them don't be cruel. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And so if you want to be on the left and on the compassion side and on the let's care for each other and then hate half the country, that doesn't make sense to me. So I'm trying to foster these environments where people connect over something else, in hopes that maybe friendship will start and conversations will start. We don't get very political at the party because of this. Like, we're trying to provide this space where you connect on other things. And we like having these areas at our parties where you can just talk. Like, there's always multiple rooms, and every smaller venue we've been in before has had this kind of like area where people can just network and meet and eavesdrop on each other or whatever, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, I really hope that's what we can bring to the table beyond the music and beyond everything. It's this idea of like the possibility of coexistence without conflict. And we could disagree, I mean, of course, but this automatic dismissal of the other side is something that is very dangerous, especially as, and I'm going to get gloomy now, but as the world is getting more and more difficult to live with, and the potential global climate catastrophes that are coming, if we don't work on this, it's just going to be clans like The Last of Us at the end of the day. If you watch that show, you know what I'm talking about. It's just going to be little communities separated from each other, going back 600 years back to like complete communitarism and fights and killing. I mean, when you remove the resources, who knows what's going to happen if we're polarized like this, you know?
Yeah, no, of course. And
Fun times.
I do think, and this is something that I think about a lot. You know, I feel like, especially, let's say, white Americans or people who have been a little disconnected from their cultures can forget how bad that is. You know, my parents left a civil war. And so that always stays in my mind. Like sometimes people on the right and on the left will say words without knowing what they mean. And that does concern me. That does concern me greatly, I would say.
Like what words, for example?
I don't know. I get very concerned. I mean, because I think it's more clear on the right, and I do want to make that clear, but there are some times with leftists where they'll say, they'll talk about just definitively like revolution and overthrowing and, just these words. And I'm like, guys, that means innocent people dying. Like, there's no other way.
Mhm.
That means civilians being hurt. I
Yeah.
know, even if you're coming at it, everyone thinks they're right, right? Everyone thinks that they are the correct, and I don't know why I'm saying all this, but they are the say all be all. But those words have consequences, and people will get hurt that have no right to be hurt or don't need to be hurt.
And also the relativity of all the words too, because when you say a word like oppression, it's kind of relative in a way. Like at this point, like if you're not allowed to read a book in high school, it's called oppression. But what you tell someone who comes from a place of complete and utter oppression, and they hear that, oh, they banned this book in high schools now, so now the left is saying that we're oppressed because we can't read this book in high school now, which is a fair argument to make, but it's the choice of words, as you say, that fuels this conflict
Yeah.
between the two sides. I mean, America is not the only place with two polarized sides. It's just that the narrative and the historical context of it is very weak. Like people don't get taught a lot of history, of world history. Compared to even in Europe, like people are taught much more world history to contextualize a little bit more what's going on in their own country. So yes, I don't blame anyone for this. I just the only way to blame people is that they're not demanding more education, I guess, in a way,
Yeah.
because a lot of the problems come from ignorance right now, and we've gone way beyond the scope of talking about parties and everything, but it's like this ignorance that's plaguing this whole continent, I would say. It's like it's not even ignorance, it's narrow minds. We learn about who we are, and that's enough because we're the best. So let the others learn about us. I grew up learning French history and US history. Like I knew all these things. I'm not expecting people in America to know Lebanese history, but just broad strokes of the World War would be appreciated,
Mhm.
And but because it contextualizes your own suffering, history can be actually a very healing tool.
Yeah.
On the personal level. Like if you're going through some shit and you think it's the end of the world, contextualizing it through history, through even like, for example, a lot of things that helped me, like with my queer struggles, is to look at queer history and not to compare myself with people, but to just contextualize that I'm living my struggles from a much easier place than other people were, and be inspired by the fact that when these people were faced with these problems, they didn't go on Twitter and complain. They just organized and they just moved, and they probably cried and got depressed and all these things too. But like making a real action versus like complaining. And I feel like complaining has become the new activism. I mean, there's amazing activism happening, don't get me wrong, but on the general, like there's a lot of like, I'm complaining, therefore I'm an activist kind of attitude today that is not helping at all. And it's just actually creating more problems.
Yeah.
And that's why I stopped. I mean, honestly, after the pandemic, I'm really done on a personal level, like showcasing my beliefs on Instagram and things like that. Like there's no point. There's no point. It's become a game. It's like saying like I'm pro this and pro that. To me, it has become the equivalent of putting a filter on your photo. It's like, look, I'm so good. I want the rights of these people, but it doesn't change anything. Unfortunately, I mean that's sad. I wish it did. I wish posting something on Instagram changed. There's cases where it does,
Mhm.
and cases where it needs to be done, but I find that people are too easily relieved by like, oh, I posted about it, my job is done.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. And obviously not everyone can solve everything, but there is this general sentiment of laziness and intolerance. And I find the people who are most intolerant are the ones who are preaching tolerance, which is very ironic.
Yeah.
So, because if you're preaching tolerance, I assume you know a little bit what you're talking about. So why aren't you more tolerant? Versus people who have not been taught these principles, who have not studied this, and who have not been taught to be tolerant, being intolerant. At least, I mean, it's not completely accurate, but they have like some sort of excuse. Whereas you are coming, say, from an academic circle where you've studied this stuff, for example, and then you're telling me to be tolerant and then being completely intolerant to a whole bunch of people. That's just not my vibe. I acknowledge actually, I really do acknowledge the need for radicalisms on each side. But the problem is that the way our media is constructed today is that we only hear about these sides. We don't hear about the center.
Yeah.
And going back to our mission artistically, for me, is to really reclaim the center as this place of processing and healing. I think this sums it up a little bit philosophically.
I want to talk about real quick. Way earlier, you said that Laylit was almost like a drop in the bucket of this movement, right? And if we think about it in terms of both the specific diaspora, SWANA, and the greater diasporas in this country, whether they be Black, Latin, East Asian, what would you want people to take away from Laylit 10 years in the future? Or what would you want them to say, like, this is what we helped push in the conversation?
I mean, I think we did touch upon all this, but if I had to give one answer, it's really, I mean, I don't see Laylit as this major change or disruption in anything. But again, if there's one thing I wanted to come out of it, is that on the musical front, is that there's richness in our region's music beyond what you imagined, and not more or less than other regions, but it's been typically seen as a very monolithic region musically and culturally. So on the cultural side, I'd like people to leave with a little more understanding of the nuances of our culture. No one's going to ever understand it fully. I will never understand it fully. It's too big. But just this idea that to break this stereotype and hopefully inspire people from our community and from other communities to be like, it's possible to make a space if you come at it from a place of intention and I would say even kindness, honestly. And that's something we always wonder about ourselves. Are we too nice? And I always tell the other two, like, this is how we do it. And if this means we go slower or faster, anything doesn't matter. Like, we have to go about this from a place of not pure, but like a good intention. This isn't about fame. This isn't about money. This is really about a bigger mission to take space. And I think this mission is not specific to our community. And when I say we're in a drop in a bucket, I include our work with the work of all the other minorities. It's this idea that we need to get to a point, hopefully in 10 years, which, listen, I'm as optimistic as I am. I don't think that's where we're headed, but we're trying to mitigate the effects of segregation at this point. Like, we seem to be headed in a place where we are all going to separate from each other. So we're trying to really alleviate a little bit of that and try to get people together instead of away from each other. And I definitely see in the future for Laylit more and more collaborations with other communities and other parties from other communities, just to not end up being ghettoized and like, okay, here are the Black parties and the Arab parties and the Asian parties, Like at some point we're gonna need, like as we all form our individualities, we're gonna need to like find a way to come together somehow, so that eventually, hopefully, it no longer becomes defined by where we're from, and it's just a cool party scene. And New York is a very good place to do that, honestly, and it's infectious because once New York does it, the other cities look at New York and they're like, we want that too. So yeah, hopefully people can look at us in 10 years and be like, they were part of the creation of this inclusive and collaborative scene that has now become God knows what it will become in 10 years. I don't know. But hopefully they'll also look at us and be like, oh my God, they used to call this like an Arab party. How like it's so like reductive. Like I just also want them to judge us in 10 years. Because as a collective movement, we would have gotten to a place where it's like totally unacceptable to say SWANA techno anymore, because it's, you know, like that's the dream, is that they look at us as old school kind of people who were doing it like, but I mean, and also acknowledge our contribution, but I'm hoping that the next generation will do it even more freer than we are.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll be these old schmucks soon enough, you know.
That's all you can hope for, right?
That's all. I mean, what more can you ask for? You know, I want to be an old schmuck.
Oh my God, that's so funny. Before we close out, is there any other cities you guys are going to go to? I know there's been Toronto, Montreal, DC, New York. Where else are you thinking about? Like,
We haven't really done Toronto yet. We dipped our foot in it once at the beginning, and it's been a very tricky city to approach. But we definitely have other cities on our mind. I mean, I'm not going to make any promises, but there's definitely thoughts of going to the other coast very soon, most likely this year. And we always think about Europe, but I think for now that's not a priority for us. But there's other cities. I mean, I don't like to say where and when until it happens, but so far we're in Montreal, Ottawa, Detroit, Washington, and New York. And I can make a very clear promise that there will be more cities this year, but I don't want to give any false hopes, because we're very particular about starting in a new city and doing it right. You know, DC took a year and a half to find the right way to do it, and still, when we start doing it, it's still going to improve and get refined. But DC was one of the trickiest, actually, places to start in for multiple reasons, which I will not get into. But we didn't want to do it until it felt like we were doing it right.
okay, I can respect all of that. Yeah.
So that's the situation with Toronto now. For example, it's been 2 years we've wanted to go, and it just hasn't felt like right. The opportunities, the venues we talked to, like nothing has felt like that was going to be the right vibe for us. So we're not going to force ourselves to go just because it's the biggest city in Canada, you know. Like we don't really care.
Interesting.
It's about finding the right space and right mood for our community to thrive, and to get all these things we talked about today. They need to be in place for this party to work.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just a party without a mission, without a feeling. And so, yeah.
And especially just for what it is, right? Like the space is super important. Like it is what drives the whole car. Yeah, that makes sense.
The space and the people and who you attract and who you partner with, and even the way the booker of the venue speaks to you is important, because it shows you whether they're going to help you foster that space or whether they just want the money out of it, you know. And we've been very lucky to have found all these venues we are in now, because they're all extremely helpful in helping us evolve. And DC, we've only done one party, so we're very far from the optimal vibe we want to create there, but we're going to come back a lot. And usually by the fourth or fifth party, it's the sweet spot has been reached, and then it's about trying to keep it fresh.
Mhm.
But I would say that there's still a bunch of work to do in Washington, and hopefully, if you keep coming, you'll see it evolve, and you'll see us, because we also need to understand the people in DC. Like we don't treat every city like it's the same people. Every city has, like, if you come to parties in different cities, it's like almost different parties. We just really cater to people in different cities because there are very drastic cultural differences between Washington and New York. Like it's not a homogeneous situation where we could just do exactly the same thing we do and then people will buy it. This is not like a rock show,
Yeah.
So even a comedian will insert jokes about, oh, DC, I've been to this place. And we're obviously there's a core thing we do and we do in every city, but then you have a good 25% you have to cater. Even the bookings, and like for example in Detroit, the party is way more electronic and way more techno oriented. We can't, like, if we had done this the first time in DC, people would have been like, what's happening? What is this? Like, this is not what I thought it would be. So it's managing expectations, trading. I mean, it's a lot of work.
It sounds like a lot of work. I feel like that's a whole other episode, just getting more into it. Like
Yeah.
I'm so interested behind the whole
But
machinations.
that's the making of. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a different conversation.
Where can people find you?
Most of our communications are through Instagram at Laylit Party. There's a Facebook, but honestly, it's very underused. And we personally really like communicating through newsletters. So if you go to our Instagram, there's a link in the bio where you can subscribe to newsletters, and we usually announce shows there first and early bird tickets and things like that. Because the farther we can get from social media, the better. But obviously, you can't escape it. But it's mostly Instagram and that newsletter, I would say, are the two best ways to reach us.
Okay. I'll put that all in the podcast notes. Thank you so much. This has been really great.
Thank you. It's been a really cool conversation.
Quite accidentally, I'm not gonna say I mistimed this episode because it was supposed to come out before Miami Freedom Project, but given the state of how things are in Florida, I decided to move things around given the state of the U.S., national politics at the moment. I put Miami Freedom Project ahead of this. And in doing so, I didn't realize I was timing this with the holy month of Ramadan, first of all, which I believe starts tonight, and the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War invasion. And this gave me pause. I really didn't know if I should delay this episode or, push it back a couple days, or I was unsure of how to move forward. And I think the most important part, I I'm taken back to what Phil said earlier in the conversation, right? Where he said if he were a U.S. citizen, it would give him pause that the tax dollars go to these colonial ventures. And it's it has given me pause. He got me. He got me with that one. I It's so complicated, right? I think what we have lost lately, in my opinion, is the ability to hold two things at once. What I mean by that is this: I believe I can be grateful for the sacrifices my family made and grateful for having grown up in the United States while also being critical of the nature of this country. Because I think that's I don't know if those things are incongruent with each other, right? I think they're in complete conversation because that is the nature of this country's project. It's the nature of doing better than the day before. Yeah, we're in weird times, and I hope when at the beginning I said Laylit is an inspiration to me, I mean that. I think it's really cool what they've done, and I want to extrapolate a little more because I said that they were a dance party for the SWANA diaspora, and I would maintain that's pretty true, right? I would say that it's definitely tailored to a certain audience, but that feeling of home, I think, is universal, in my opinion. I felt very welcomed whenever I go, and that sense of cohesion is a beautiful thing. What I've been trying to do with this podcast is build on intercultural dialogues and hear people out. And yeah, I aim to be forward looking. I aim to be inclusive. But in a weird way, I agree with Phil. I think the ultimate goal for all of us should be to outdate ourselves, to succeed enough so that whatever comes next isn't the new abnormal, right? It's just the norm. I think that's really cool. I'm once again, I just want to reiterate, I'm really grateful for the time Laylit took and Phil took to come on this show. Really grateful. All their links are in the description down below, including specifically the newsletter and their Instagram. Yeah, thank you for coming on. I hope you guys have enjoyed this conversation. This has been Minority Report with me, your host, Salomón Flamenco. You can follow our Instagram down below. And if you want to continue the conversation, please email us at minorityreport.beat@gmail.com. Don't forget to follow, rate, and share with everyone you know. We will see you next time. Next week, next time.